When we think about sound design in these old Nintendo games, we think about sounds that are designed by the same people that are composing the game's soundtracks. In those early games, it was pretty common for the video game music composers to also have the duty of sound designer. And sometimes those duties could really pile up. Apparently, for the early music and sound designers that were designing games for the arcades, they would even have to make decisions about what sort of speakers were going to be equipped on the arcade unit. So when we think of some classic Nintendo composers, for instance, like Koji Kondo or Hip Tanaka, those guys all were doing the sound design for their games too. And for instance, in the case of Koji Kondo, he was still responsible for sound design even leading up to Ocarina of Time, when the technology had advanced considerably. Now, it's not very surprising, knowing that these sound designers are musicians and composers themselves, that the sound effects they design are oftentimes incredibly musical. In fact, some of the most iconic video game sound effects are musical sound effects. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Have you ever heard this sound? I don't know about you, but to me that sounds like I just grabbed a coin. If we slow it down, though, we can hear what's actually going on. That's right, it's just two notes. In this case, it's two notes played on one of the pulse channels. Many games following Super Mario Bros. Would use this same sound effect, but as far as I'm aware, this is the first game that uses those exact two notes to represent a coin sound. Now, I'm not sure what exactly inspired Koji Kondo to pick those two notes. The interval is a fourth. It's a pretty strong interval, and it's positioned in a pretty high range. The pitches are pretty high. And with the sort of piercing attack of the pulse channel, there is maybe almost a metallic quality to it. But you know, at this point, it's hard, at least for me, to remember what a coin sounded like before playing Super Mario Bros. Now, if we look at some of the other sound effects from that game, for instance, we see that quite a few of them are musical in nature. But we might not catch it on first, second, or 100th listening. To help uncover the musicality in some of these sounds, I'll slow them down for you. Take this sound, for instance. Let's slow that down a little bit. Again, it has the same sort of timbre and attack as the coin sound effect did, and it is utilizing one of the pulse channels. Now that means whenever you'd get a 1-up or whenever you'd get a coin, one of the channels that was playing the background music would cut out to play this sound effect. Let's listen to another couple of sound effects that utilize some of the other channels on the NES, like the noise channel. A pretty fiery sound effect. Now, how on earth did he make that? Let's slow it down. Wow. You can really start to hear the musicality of it. Almost sounds like a drum beat when you slow it down that way. Let's listen to another effect. Okay, so to me that sounds like Mario just put on his brakes. What's really going on? Really? Let's listen to that again. Wow. But in the course of the actual game, that's happening so fast that you're not really hearing it as a sequence of notes. You're just hearing this tiny little explosion of sound. And it's coupled with the wonderful graphics of Mario starting to turn the other way, that you can tell that, he's braking, and his shoes are burning rubber. Now, my favorite video game sound effect of all time is also from this game. And I stumbled on the musicality of it by accident. This sound effect is pretty familiar to anyone who's played a Mario game, and they continue to use it in a lot of Mario games. This is whenever you get a mushroom. So to me, it sounds like Mario's just grown in size. Now, what's going on there? Wow, pretty incredible, huh? Some of you might have felt like, oh, that's familiar. Isn't that somewhere else in Mario? Well, whenever you pull down the flag, there's a very similar stretch of music that occurs. And when I stumbled on this sound effect in slow motion, I just thought it was incredible how Koji Kondo had tied together his musical soundtrack and his sound effects. In this case, it's almost subliminal, but they really are stitched together. Now, this idea of musical sound effects isn't unique to this game. A lot of Nintendo games will use these sort of musical cues. In fact, if you can think of dying in any old school video game, there's probably a brief little musical cue. It might be its own little melodic material, or it might be some kind of variation on an overworld theme or some sort of main theme. And like I said, the coin effect from Mario was used in a variety of games. And a very similar effect is used in the Sonic the Hedgehog games for the rings. For the ring effect, they use an entire triad. And if any of you have some time to spare, you should Google Sonic ring noise cash register. And you can read about how some modern cash registers use a sound effect that's eerily similar to the power ring sound from Sonic the Hedgehog whenever you scan an item. In the 8-bit era of video games, these sorts of musical sound effects accompany deaths, discoveries, power-ups, completions of levels, major achievements, and missteps that the player might make. Another classic video game sound effect that has a lot of musicality to it comes from another game that Koji Kondo was the sound designer on, Legend of Zelda. This is the sound whenever you discover a secret. And if we slow that down, it's a very interesting sequence of notes. Now, this is such an effective sound effect, or musical snippet, whatever we're going to call it, that it's used in every single Zelda game, similar to this sound, which these guys use to announce their track of the week. But of course, not all video game sound effects are going to be this inherently musical. Whether it consists of a sequence of notes or not, it has to be produced using the same equipment that does produce the music. Let's listen to some more iconic video game sounds, like jumps. Now in this case, if we slow it down, it pretty much sounds like the sound that we're familiar with, just a little bit slower. We don't seem to uncover a secret little melody. But what's happening here is basically a pitch bend. I don't know about you, but one of my favorite sound effects comes from Pac-Man, and it's the sound when you get eaten by a ghost. And if we slow that down, it's a series of very unique pitch bends. For me, I'm just fascinated with those early sound effects, and in a lot of ways, those sounds are little unsung heroes from that video game era. The box art, the graphics, the gameplay, the music, they're all a huge part of the experience. But honestly, when you take away the sound effects, it's not really the same game.